All right.
Excellent.
Get this started. Let me share a presentation here. All right. Give it just a few minutes for everything to get fired up.
Get everybody settled in.
Jared, you awake? You just had a long flight to come back to the country. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, awake, ready to go.
All right. Well, let's get started. Greetings, everyone. Appreciate everyone joining us for the webinar today. We are going to discuss sort of what's going on in the state of VMware at the moment. I am Jeremy Oakey. I'm the VP of Field Engineering here at Spectro Cloud, and joining me is my esteemed and honored guest, Jared. Do you want to introduce you?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Jared Cheney. I'm the VP of Services for North America for SoftwareONE, and glad to be here. Glad to get a chance to talk about this with you, Jeremy.
Great, thanks. All right, so let's start with just what's sort of the elephant in the room. Workloads will continue to be hypervisor-based virtualization. This is a Gartner quote through 2027. I think they're probably being nice. I don't know that 2027 is probably not a quick enough off ramp for a lot of folks that have built their data centers. They've built their mission critical applications. They've built their IT operations management around 100% virtualization is the way to go. And we've been operating that way for a decade, maybe even more success.
Right, a decade to maybe a dozen years, right? And I think I think this one is pretty striking, Jeremy, for a couple of reasons, and not the least of which is that there's the technology side of this, which certainly we'll go into a little bit, but there's also that people management side of this, the skills based environments, and I think there's a lot of layers behind why people are sticking with that hypervisor-based virtualization. But I think it's interesting to think about from certainly the technology side and what's available and what has matured over the last decade. But also, that the people management side of this, the skills building, the training, the tool sets that people use, and getting familiarity. I think, for a lot of different reasons, people have hung on to things that worked because they knew them and because they could continue to use them at a known cost point, at a known outcome.
Yeah.
No,
that's a good point. I think the landscape was different 15 years ago. We made choices to be on VMware very willingly 15 years ago because it was the technology that worked. There were other options, but they were very focused, very niche, or they just weren't production ready. They were great for like dev test, but could you put your Oracle and your SQL and your SAP workloads on top of them? If you even go back that far, remember those tier one vendors didn't even support, like virtualization wasn't even supported officially.
It was all bare metal at the time, right? And to your point, that there's a lot of people who not only were you sort of staking your reputation and maybe even your employment on your choices, but there was also that maintenance side of it, the actual sustainability of the environments, the amount of work that went into support that people had to pay attention to as that evolved.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, I think we're getting a lot of phone calls. I'm sure you are as well, Jared, with, what do I do now? I'm uncomfortable as a customer with the situation I'm being forced into. I had a call the other day where they said, could we get off in September? And it's like, well, no, that's a little, you're renewing in September. That's probably not going to happen. Think of the time it took you to get where you are in operational maturity and just test and accept, the logistics of this are significant. So, can you just simply swap this one for that one? I don't remember this working out so well for Indiana Jones. It seemed to at first, but
there were a few moments where you thought it was going to, and then not so much, right? That they get chased down by the boulder. I think there's, to your point, there's a lot of people now looking at it as, hey, I've got a decision to make here moving forward about how I'm going to handle this, and can I quickly just change one thing for another thing? And while that might look good on the surface, may even appear to work for a brief minute or two, there's a lot of complexity there, and there's a lot of things to chase down, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If we just think about our first endeavors into virtualization way back when, we used to call it the VMware wall, if you remember, where people would get about 25, 30%, and then they'd hit issues. It seemed to be good. It was the tier 3 or the low hanging fruit apps. And, if in my experience, because this is my background before I moved into cloud and Kubernetes, was virtualization and data centers and
Yep.
storage. A lot of it was storage. They just didn't have the infrastructure set up right to really get to that 100% virtualization. So I don't know. What are your thoughts there? I mean, obviously, there's history here we should learn from and not just jump too quickly.
Agreed. No, and I think you nailed it. I think one of the big ones was certainly storage and the the latency or performance of that. But also you bumped into things where you've got to pay attention to your network differently. You're sending data different directions than you did previously. Those workloads have dependencies, and sometimes putting some of those things on that same bare metal system in a virtualized environment was a little different performance than people had thought. So there were a lot of lessons that we learned early on, and yeah, just like you, kind of growing up through those years of learning how to do things that we had done a certain way for a long time, now doing them in the virtualized way. We learned a lot of things about how things performed, and there's some very good lessons learned that we had during that period that we got to bring forward to this one.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think we have options here. I think the point of sort of talking about a little bit of the pain in the history is that the landscape has matured quite a bit. There are hypervisors out there that are actually quite mature and quite capable. There are people that have successfully run on hyperconverged platforms or alternatives to VMware. So they're certainly there, but it's a pretty significant effort. You're moving into an entirely new ecosystem. It's a full retooling. So really, does it meet your long-term technology goals? It's funny, I'll tell you a story, Jared. I didn't tell you when we were preparing. I had a customer years ago who was telling me, hey, I want to do something different and I want to modernize my app. And I said, hey, your app gets its resiliency from the infrastructure. Can you quickly refactor the application and modernize it so that it's really a resiliency aware application? And then the customer said, no, not really. And I said, well, then you just need to invest in that very mature, very stable infrastructure that's expensive for the next 3 years that gives you this resiliency that you've come to depend on. And by the way, let's not have this conversation again in 3 years that you didn't work on modernizing your applications in the meantime, that you're going to have to keep reinvesting in what's becoming more and more a legacy infrastructure, but that you depend on to run your business.
Yeah, that's actually it's not as uncommon as we'd like to believe, right? I think that as people look at how they're handling the outcomes that those workloads are trying to drive, they have for quite a period of time now tried to do it, in an efficient and effective way that they understood, that they knew how, that they had the team to support, they've got the right tool sets for. But now there's new variables, right? First, to your point, things have matured a lot. The way we can break apart applications to data and the relationships is very different than the options that we had to us, even probably 5 to 7 years ago, let alone a decade ago when a lot of the virtualization move was happening. But I think that it's important to also recognize that as you are moving through this, there's a new technology set, there's a new tool set, there's the people, the support, and the maintenance side of it. But then there's all of those feature sets that are available now that, to your point, you have to modernize the application to really be aware of and take advantage of in a way that you didn't before. And to your point, you're going to either pay for it to hold that infrastructure at a level that is resilient enough to handle the shortcomings of your application, or you're going to pay for it maybe once to move to that new type of framework or enterprise architecture that you really want, so that you can take advantage of some of those cost savings and realization of a return on investment that you could potentially get to. Yeah. But it's not a quick flip the switch kind of process usually.
Yeah, no, agree. Well, I think that it's sort of the story you're telling is that if you're on a very short runway, maybe you can move some things quickly, but this analysis needs to be pretty deliberate. Some business applications maybe aren't worth the investment of modernizing. They age out and finish their life in the technology stack they're built for. So when we look at these 3 options I'm presenting, it could be that actually a combination of all these options are what you need. Some of these applications that have a life cycle that's maybe nearing its end and they aren't worth investing in. Could you move them to the cloud? Could you move them to a third party that maybe is still, committed to the VMware portfolio and is going to run it for you, so that you can take your smart folks and retool and retrain and move them into a future that's more aligned with what you need in the future for your next upcoming breed of applications, mobile applications, AI, edge. Those things, obviously, you need a different application pattern, different application architecture to them. So it could be that actually that your analysis means you have some that move to one or more of these options over time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've talked about hybrid cloud as sort of this thing that people thought was maybe a step to cloud, or it's an end state for some folks. But I think what we're seeing, to your point, is depending on what workloads or what application stacks you need to run and the purpose that those are serving and the lifespan that they're going to serve, you might have a variety of scenarios that make sense for certain parts of your workloads. And so you might be quite possibly in a hybrid scenario that looks a lot like these three sort of buckets for the short term or midterm, depending on the lifespan of those applications. And to your point, where the value is going to get realized. Does it make sense to modernize everything? No. Some things that are legacy really do have an end of life, that you can see that end of roadmap. And so making sure that whatever takes their place or serves that next role moving forward is taking advantage of a lot of the things that are available now versus when maybe they came into service. That's the big thing people need to spend some time evaluating pretty heavily.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Obviously, we here at Spectro Cloud have a view that we focus on the right-hand column. So we are going to talk about that a little bit. We're trying to be sort of advisory and consultative here in our little chat and not really turn this into a product pitch. But I think there's one thing that VMs, you mentioned hybrid applications. There was always this promise that VMs would just be portable. They would move around with ease. And it turned out that actually wasn't really the case. I mean, to me, multi-cloud in the past was really app 1 runs on target 1, app 2 runs on target 2, and one was on premise, one was in the cloud. And we really didn't find like an application that stretched and truly was a hybrid multi-target, multi-cloud application. And I think we are obviously seeing that with Kubernetes. Even taking a container and having a VM be inside a container, to me, there's two things that a VM's never been able to be. It's never been able to be that portable. Containers are. 40 gig containers a little big, but still, we have technologies that replicate around the containers in repositories and make them very reusable. And the second thing is we were never really able to have the reusability. Virtual machines tended to drift. Every deployment turned into a snowflake. So our concepts like GitOps and CI/CD tool chains, we've never really been able to apply those to virtual machines until now, with sort of option 3 helps us deal with some of those problems.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that's really important for people to evaluate as they're doing this analysis or maybe even going through some advisory work. I think when you look at the actual workload that it's getting produced, I think you hit on something that I love. You call them everything's a snowflake, because what they do is they will continue to customize to get that fine-tuned performance or to get the fine-tuned outcome. But what you've done now is that you've created lots of different conditional one-offs. And to your point, that creates a burden of support. It creates, a limit to the portability or agility sometimes even of those. And certainly, when you've got governance programs, whether it's DevOps or DevSecOps or, whatever ops du jour we have this time around, you tend to try to bring your consolidating factors together. And so what you find is you've got these nodes or pods or groups of not like the other things, and it gets quite cumbersome to implement some of those governance programs and to get that ROI on the investment in your tool chain or your process flow. It can be, for many, quite cumbersome. And I think that, to your point, Kubernetes allows you to, and containers in general allow you to bring a level of consistency and repeatability, scalability that you didn't really get, even though you were promised from your VM world. So yeah, I think that's a really important consideration that people need to spend some time evaluating, really what is the burden of support, what is the burden of effort, and what is the burden of scaling or de-escalate or descaling, against these environments as things grow or ebb and flow across their workloads.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, let's talk for a moment a bit about what, when Kubernetes running virtual machines is not for people, because there are certain scenarios where option one and option two might be better for some customers. If you're 100% a VMware shop, you're going to stay a virtualization machine environment for a long time, and you're not on a Kubernetes journey. Is option three really for you?
Yeah, no, and that's a great point. I think, one of the things that we do in some of the advisory work that we do, we talk through the infrastructure, we talk through really the application. We try to look from that customer inward. So across that application, the data set, and then how that interacts with the infrastructure when we're giving advice to customers. And I think to your point, there are definitely scenarios where if you're not trying to drive for some of the levels of scalability or some of the levels of agility in the application, or you don't have frequent changes, you are able to keep that governance in place. And on top of that, you've got your tool chains built out. Your team is trained on how to leverage the efficiencies and effectiveness of what you've got deployed. Maybe it doesn't make sense to be looking at, with that existing workload, moving into Kubernetes or moving into some other types of containerization, serverless architecture. There's certainly use cases where that makes a lot of sense. But what's important is to look not just short term, which a lot of us, we tend to deal with that 3-month rolling window of like what's burning, what's on fire, what's happening right now in the business, but also making sure that we're looking a little bit further out. What's going to be next? What is that next evolution of the application that's running closer to the customer? Is it going to move more mobile? Is it going to, need to leverage different factors of scalability than our previous, additions did? And I think those are the things where if you can make pretty logical, smart determinations about where this application is going, you can set that 18-month roadmap pretty effectively against what you need to be architecting towards. And to your point, yeah, there's definitely some scenarios where those first two circles that you've got here make a lot of sense for a lot of customers. But there's definitely, as you look at where the market is going and what that customer experience or expectation is going to be, there's definitely going to be some use cases that move into that third circle.
Yeah. Well, it's good timing. Someone's asked a question. What are the implications of staying with VMware in the short and long term?
Yeah, great question. So implications, you've got to make sure now, obviously with Broadcom's acquisition and some of the price points changing, and also some of the changes that could be expected in the tech stack, you've got to make sure that you've done an evaluation of what your cost of purchase or procurement this year is, but also what's your cost of ownership going to be over the life cycle of that application stack. And I think this is what you and I were alluding to earlier, and I know we had a little bit of a chat about it earlier, is let's make sure that you've done the evaluation of what your burden on your technology as well as your people is going to be. And if it does make more sense, yes, you're going to probably pay a little bit more out of pocket this year, or at least your pricing component's going to change, or maybe the way you license things looks a little different. But there's ways to do a lot of what you want to do, or to stay consistent. Sure. But I think where you have to make that evaluation of what's happening right now in the market, obviously with that price point change, it's a moment of reflection of, are we getting the value out of that stack that we need to, based on that price point and based on changes that are potentially coming in the future as well, with the best of our ability to say, does it make more sense now to invest in that next evolution of the technology?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about people for a moment on that question. I think the thing that was most surprising to me that's come out recently is the change away from ESXi free. When you think about, all of us had, where we even ran some ESXi free at home in our home labs. How do you develop the new up and coming folks? To me, I sort of equated a bit to, this gets to where like you have COBOL people on mainframes. All of a sudden they were really in demand, and like the people who have a VCDX or have been lifelong VCPs. I mean, I've had a VCP for a long time before I moved on from it. How do you develop those next round of folks who are going to maintain your infrastructure when the low cost educational component is sort of now gone?
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point. I think what you're going to have to make as part of that evaluation of which technology direction you need to take and for which components of your enterprise infrastructure make sense, you're going to have to make an investment as a company in maintaining some of those things. Either that or having a partner who can do some of those trainings. But to your point, that low cost, no cost sort of build the ecosystem of talented individuals who really understand it is going to change, and so there's now an investment required to maintain that same level of intimate knowledge, which means either a you've got to have a training partner that can give your team access to those things, or a partner where you're going to recruit some of that talent from, or you're going to have to make an investment as an organization to have labs and sandboxes and demo environments where you can play around with it and make sure that people are able to get to that same level of technical knowledge. Because I think, to your point, that's one of the really key things that has built this ecosystem, right? Is the ability at scale for people to self-learn, to self-pace, to get their hands on the technology. That's evolving and changing, and it's going to mean that there's a different level of investment. And I think that's one of the things that we advise people to make sure that. That's why we don't just talk about the technology side of it and the license equation. You've got to also talk about your people and your skills development and your people management side of getting those skills into the hands of the individuals who are going to have to live with and run this and maintain this day to day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, good point, Jared. I think there's a couple technologies that you sort of have to exclude out of this decision making too. Let's start first with virtual desktops, VDI. Very specific use case designed for a very
Yep.
specific thing. The way you compose desktops, the way the connection pooling comes in from thin clients or from edge. I think those are obviously very bespoke, vertical, specifically configured. We've had a few calls saying, "Hey, can we move virtual desktops onto Kubernetes?" I would be hesitant on that one.
I was going to say, it might be a fun use case to play around with, but to your point, I think that's one of those niches that it's still delivering the value at a level that's commensurate with what the market needs. And to your point, I don't think we've done enough testing or development, to be able to make an easy transition in those spaces. So yeah, I would agree. I think that one is one where you're going to have to figure out the right way to cost manage and license in this new paradigm. And there's some partners out there who are great at this. We have some options for folks that are really struggling in this space. Certainly reach out to us. But I think that it is one of those niche areas where, to be fair, the VM world will continue to persist because, to your point, there's so many factors around that environment that we have really quite dialed in, and so it makes it now just a matter of let's make sure that we've got the right pricing model and licensing model to make sure that you can still drive the level of value at a price point that's commensurate with your business.
Yeah, and that could be option number two. There are some alternatives out there that have matured. If you're on VMware Horizon today and uncomfortable with are they going to stay committed to it, or is it going to just cost me 3 times as much? There are some other options that are mature out there. The other one that comes to mind, Jared, is vSAN, the software, virtualized storage. Storage is critical, we said, to virtualization and VMs, even on Kubernetes. You have to have a solid storage infrastructure to support VMs on Kubernetes. And maybe the vSAN component is one that either keeps you over in that world, or you very quickly have to find an alternative that's a little more affordable.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's one of those things where, again, based on the use case and based on what your company is doing with that workload, it is one of those things that is quite specific. When you look at the storage usage, but also, maybe even load balancing, network side of it, some of the same considerations, right? To make sure that depending on how you need to scale your business or how that runs against your environment, it can definitely keep you in that sort of first 2 circle kind of group, or potentially just a reconfigured, reevaluated approach to your existing technology. But I think it is one of those things that no matter what solution you're going to be from amongst our options here, you've got to really understand your storage, your networking, all of the things that can introduce or control the latency points of your solution, making sure that you get to the performance level that you're looking for from your workloads.
Yeah, no, for sure. So hopefully that sort of answered the question a bit that came in. I think when you start talking about just the core technology of virtualizing, running a hypervisor, presenting virtual machines, that obviously that works well. There's a lot of other hypervisors. KubeVirt is built on top of KVM. That's matured. So I don't really have any concern running virtual machines. We'll dig in a little more later, but even things like continuity, disaster recovery. I mean, we have solutions in Kubernetes to fail over from data center 1 to data center 2 on top of Kubernetes. What it isn't, though, obviously, is there's a whole VMware portfolio around virtualization. And, it took a long time to build up that portfolio. If you're really heavily invested into Log Insight and the VROPS, and they have the financial, the FinOps components, they've sort of stepped in and out of a bit. If you own those things, and they're highly coupled into your virtualization IT operations, you're deeper in the VMware ecosystem. This is not
so you've got to evaluate whether A, it's worth it, and then B, what kind of time scale you're looking at to move forward, right? Because to your point, that the more you have invested, built around, whether it's with sort of the native tooling or a lot of our customers' cases with some additional integrated tooling that they've done, it does deepen the connection there. And then again, just layers of things you got to evaluate as to if you're going to change the solution versus just, pay more for the solution that you've already sort of invested in, right?
Yep, exactly. Well, let's sort of maybe move on, to dig into like, when is it, what is KubeVirt? Why is it a good opportunity? When is it the right option? I think we've talked to some folks, and one quote we had was, "Oh, so you're just running KubeVirt." Well, it's a little more than that. Installing KubeVirt when you're a Kubernetes expert in a non-production environment, sure, it's easy to fire up an open source project on a little lab and say, "Hey, I ran a Windows or an Ubuntu virtual machine. Ta-da!"
Yeah.
But what does it mean when you're actually trying to take this into production?
And I think that the devil's in the details, as they say, right? But I think the layers of complexity that start to unfold, especially as you look at production environments, can get quite deep quite quickly, right? And I think to your point, the surface level, or what looks like might be an easy, quick flip type solution, you quickly understand that there is a boulder that will roll downhill on you, like Indiana Jones when you try to flip over. And I think this is where I would say, what we talk about with our customers is that planning phase, the initial understanding your existing environment, understanding the depth of complexity based on your current solution, but also understanding the depth of complexity you're going to introduce with additional solutions. The reason you're going towards a serverless environment, or moving even to, depending on your cloud scaler, trying to take advantage of some of those serverless components, the complexities start to be pretty significant, and make sure that you have to detail them out in your planning. This isn't something you just sort of stumble into, or you will hurt yourself, right? Like that's not something to just be taken lightly. To your point, sure, if you want to stand it up in your dev environment or sandbox to start to build the familiarity, you might be able to stand it up quite quickly. But once you layer in all of the depth of your enterprise domain, it starts to get quite cumbersome. And you've got to make sure that you've really thought through how you get there.
Yeah. Well, Jared, you make me think about, folks that are operating virtualization environments. I mean, I did a lot of consulting in that space, and they were really treated like pets. A lot of folks didn't successfully use auto deploy. They
Correct.
didn't really treat the ESXi hypervisors and clusters as like infrastructure as code or as immutable. So I think partly in making this move and choosing Kubernetes as a place to run virtual machines, you should be looking at getting where the configuration is immutable. I can just fire up more Kubernetes hosts that can run containers or virtual machines, and it's simple. I don't need an expert. If someone leaves the company, there's not a brain drain of skills. We've got automation. It's infrastructure as code. Obviously with Pallet, this is what we're doing, is managing Kubernetes nodes and making them desired state and immutable. So it's sort of just normal for us, but we don't have that in the virtualization world. We don't treat VMs that way, and we don't even treat the VM infrastructure that way. So I think, to me, that's the one thing you should accomplish in this move, is you've always wanted to have immutable infrastructure and infrastructure as code, and not been able to pull it off in your VMware environment. So when you make this change, that's one thing you're achieving by moving on to Kubernetes.
For sure, you have to, and I think you hit the nail on the head, and I think that's one of the things around scalability, repeatability, that people often misinterpret, right? And to your point, that we have created part of our snowflake syndrome. We've created all of these things that have unique context, unique, distinctive outcomes that they're driving. And in order to really take advantage and to get to where they want to be, you gotta get to the infrastructure as code. You got to get to the immutability. You've got to get to the layer of being able to rapidly reproduce or scale up, scale down, without cumbersome context, right? And I think that's where that's exactly what you're talking about. And I think that's where some of that unique value proposition really sits for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and so for us, partly of putting virtual machines on top of Kubernetes means you're running on bare metal. So part of our solution is you need to have a bare metal cloud, because the old days where we moved off of physical machines to virtualization was because the time it took to procure and rack and configure, and that wasn't a bare metal cloud. That was bare metal provisioning by hand, by moving in silos of people, and that's not what this can be. So
very labor intensive, manual process, not scalable, not repeatable, and costly, right?
Yeah. We all had those slides that showed like 4 or 5 months of all the steps it took to spec, buy, build, rack, configure, just to get to the point
expand data centers, right? Yeah, exactly. So
yeah. So this does sort of depend on treating bare metal differently, because we're putting Kubernetes on bare metal here and removing the hypervisor entirely. So obviously we're using canonical MAS. There's also Equinix Metal. The cloud providers also offer bare metal instance types. So for us, we're putting this virtualization KubeVirt on top of Kubernetes, assuming it's on a bare metal cloud.
Right.
And so that is sort of conceptually like how you could have run VMware with auto deploy. You could have had that kind of bare metal like experience where you could just boot up new ESX hypervisors. I'm not sure why, because the technology did work. A lot of organizations just never were able to get to that level of automation with their ESXi vSphere stand-up process.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's now, I think we're now at a level of maturity where people understand the level of granularity of what they're trying to drive or the outcome that they're trying to get to, and how they've got to map to that ROI. And I think taking advantage of actually going sort of back to the bare metal, but bare metal at scale, bare metal at speed, which is something that we never had. And to your point, even when the technology got there in a VM instance world, we didn't take advantage of it in the same way. And I think that this is something that people are latching onto Kubernetes to get to that level of sort of quote simplicity, but simplicity that carries a contextualized sort of complexity behind it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Technology moves in sort of waves. We insource, we outsource, we push it out to the edge, we pull it back to the center. What we should learn, we embraced virtualization because of the complexities of bare metal, but we weren't running bare metal clouds then. We did not have an automation framework for standing up the server. So let's dig in on KubeVirt a bit, because obviously, within Spectro Cloud Palette have created KubeVirt, but also done more, because it's more than just KubeVirt. So these are all the things that you have to be able to do snapshots, power on, power off, give people a console, let them self backup and restore. How do you map networking onto it? How do you have it be part of a pipeline and start? I said, if we're going to do this, let's actually get immutability. Let's get desired state. Let's get GitOps. Let's get a pipeline for it. And so KubeVirt obviously in and of itself doesn't give you that. So there's a lot of other things that make up getting this ready to run in production. And so we obviously call our version Virtual Machine Orchestrator. It's a lot of open source on top of Kubernetes, but if you had to DIY this, there's a lot to go figure out that we're just sort of taking care of.
Yeah, and I think the trying to get to that sort of best of both worlds, right? Getting to the layer of granular control that you need, but also doing it in the simplest path forward. I think that what you've done is you've simplified a lot of the heavy lifting of dialing in which things need to work together to get to the outcome that you're trying to drive. And I think that's one of the things that's quite interesting for us as we consult with folks around how they're making this pivot, is this gives an opportunity to just layer over the orchestration so that you get to the outcome. Because at the end of the day, most of us, well, those of us in technology might be proper geeks and we love the ins and outs of everything that's going on. Most of us are really focused on trying to drive the outcome that we're trying to get to from our workloads. And I think what this does is it simplifies that for folks to make it, not quite an ABC step, but at least a more simplified process of how do we go from where we are driving, our fleet now of potential containers and to drive that for a VMware like experience or workload, but do it in a way that's as easy to get from point A to point Y on this process flow without having to take every incremental step. Like you said, there's a lot of complexities to dial in as you start to layer on that orchestration.
Yeah, perfect. So there's a question from the audience that regarding our comment about bare metal cloud, can we run KubeVirt on a managed Kubernetes like Azure AKS or Amazon EKS? I mean, I'll start with technically yes. Can you stick this CNCF project on top of a managed Kubernetes? Yeah, absolutely. Does it mean it will work well? I think that's the consideration I would add. We offer these as layers in a desired state blueprint. So it's very simple to go and stick it on anything. You could still run KubeVirt on top of a virtualized Kubernetes, but you're getting into layers of complexity. So I think my biggest concern in the cloud, I don't think they offer the bare metal instance types for EKS and AKS. I'm thinking of EKS specifically. I don't think you can get the M5 instance type, but I have to try it. I don't know that I've actually tried EKS and tried to put it on a bare metal instance type. The storage, my next concern would be the storage capability, because the virtual machines are inherently persistent storage. Your Kubernetes that you're running your containerized microservices on, you may not have any constructs of persistent storage in that Kubernetes design today. So when you introduce virtual machines, you may be introducing a persistent storage capability that you've never tested on top of your
evaluated the outcome of, right? Yep, against your existing frameworks.
Yeah. I mean, we've done some reference architectures on like Pure Storage and NetApp, because now we have flash arrays and their storage integration is really good between the Kubernetes software storage driver and the physical array. I think vSAN sort of got popular maybe because flash arrays were super expensive. When vSAN first came out, they're sort of now the norm. And so those are challenges that are a little harder to overcome, I would say, in the cloud.
Yeah, or at least you need to be quite specific and certain about how you're going to evaluate that and test it and then implement it and make sure that you're getting the performance that you want, right?
Yeah. And it could mean that you also have to augment the managed Kubernetes with something like a Portworx, some sort of storage replication software that gives you what you need to also tie into your what virtual machines need. So is it technically possible? Yes, the KubeVirt can be added even by us. We could stick it on there. I don't know that we've validated that as a great idea just yet to run into production, but technologically it's absolutely possible. It's a CNCF project that will run on a Kubernetes cluster like anything else.
Yep.
Well, I think we've covered a lot. I want to open it up to any questions, sort of free form. If anyone has more, we're happy to answer them. I think for us, we've had a lot of folks just express interest in moving off of VMware. And in some of those conversations, they've been a little hasty. Like my example of our renewal's up in September. Can we opt by that? No, probably not. Let's slow down a little bit and measure it. So as you're going into this, Jared, I mean, obviously you guys are a consultancy and an application modernization and transformation practice. I want to sort of open up to you, like, some of the steps you guys typically recommend to a customer who's going on sort of this app modernization journey to move to cloud native and microservices and Kubernetes.
And I think, to begin with, what we do is obviously we help a customer or anybody baseline where you are, right? And not just the organizational memory that lives inside of your tech team, right? But really, truly from an architecture, from an infrastructure, from an application data landscape. Make sure you really understand where you are, and if not, bring somebody in to help you get there, right? Because you do really need to have a really strong foundation of what will have to change if you're going to go any new direction. So I think that's, having a good understanding of your starting point, but also equally important, having a really good understanding of the business objectives. What are you trying to drive? What's the outcome? What's the use case that maps to your environment? And I think from there, it's about making really informed choices, understanding your licensing and cost infrastructure, understanding the cost to procure, understanding that across the lifespan of what you're really going to be looking at from your application stack. Then, deep diving that application. Is it a legacy app that that has to be evolved, that has to modernize in order to continue move forward? Is it something that's going to get retired in 1, 2, or 3 years? These things are factors now that are going to help you to adjust the actual outcome you're going to drive for, and which direction you may or may not want to go with that particular app workload. And then I think the other thing that sometimes people forget is that there are certain applications within your environment, whether it's your ERP or maybe it's just your data environment itself, that are going to have some levels of gravity, that are going to need to pull certain things closer to it, or that other things can have certain layers of distance away from it. And so those are all things that we help really evaluate the lay of not just where you are, where you want to be, but the steps to get between those 2 points, that are going to have some interrelated dependencies. And you need to evaluate all of those things together in order to really drive the outcome that you're looking for. Because if you just take one application at a time, you're going to miss some of the synergies that you could create for yourself. You're going to miss some of the ROI that you could create for your company. If you think of it more holistically, or at least, as sort of spokes on the wheel of the business, depending on which layer you're sitting in across that. So I think, just by and large, I know it sounds like a lot of, I didn't want to come across as a bunch of consultant speak, but I think, it is important to think through your process, but think through really what you're trying to drive. What are the outcomes you're driving for? And then just make smart decisions around some of those key determining factors about where you want those key applications to live, how do they need to run, and then that starts to inform some of the rest of the things that you've got to do when there's certain layers of dependencies that are connected together. But you got to address them holistically.
Yeah, and if you're going to go on this journey and go through this pain, all the time when we do this technology shift, there's pain. Get some outcomes, get immutability, get desired state, get infrastructure as code,
Get control, right?
CD pipeline, wrap it with more governance than you had yesterday.
Yeah, and give yourself a reprieve, because that's the ROI in the back end of the maintenance side of this, right? Being able to do these things at scale with a much higher level of efficiency than you can do them now should be the desired state for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're in a good timing place. Had this change occurred, say 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was Kubernetes really, had it won? Was it stable enough and mature enough? Did we have enough instances of running it in production? I mean, this would be a different conversation. Because there was still other things that might have been the winner. I think Kubernetes has certainly sort of won its place now, I would say. But 3 years ago, maybe there was still some contenders that still had some decent market share that were fighting for it.
Yeah, but I think you're right, and I think that the timing is quite interesting. It's quite unique, and I think it does behoove everybody to really take a look right now at where you want to be, because to your point, Kubernetes is clearly going to be part of your environment at some point. Why not start looking at that now, especially when you've got really some significant either architectural or cost pressure to make some changes right now.
Yep, right. So there is another question. Is Spectro Cloud building VMO in all cloud providers? The short answer is yes. You can use VMO pretty much everywhere that Spectro Cloud supports. So public cloud, the various on-prems, bare metal. I will say, though, that we've validated it in a few very specific places, like using canonical MAS on top of a pure array, using Portworx. We've got a solution set that's specifically validated. We're working with a NetApp array with their Trident CSI driver on bare metal. So those obviously are it's a full solution stack. If you remember in virtualization, we had things FlexPods, vBlocks, VCE, because the infrastructure was so, the configuration had to be right, the support matrix had to be right. To get to that 100% virtualization, you really had to do everything well and proper. And then who did you call Friday night at 2 a.m. when it was all broken? So yes, we can run VMO in a lot of places, but when you call us Friday night at 2 a.m. and say, I'm having a problem with VMO, 3 layers deep on virtualization, on virtualization, on virtualization, I'm wondering why it's running so slow. Well, if you remember Lab Manager from years ago, when you could run 4 levels deep and you were in the 4th wall of Inception and you couldn't figure out why your VM took 20 minutes to boot.
Because it's like booting process to process to process. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a fair question. I think it's obviously we're working very diligently to have validated designs, though, that we recommend that will be successful in production and not fall into some of the traps we had before, where we hit that VM wall. We couldn't get over 30% virtualization, and we have customers running Kubernetes on bare metal today successfully and running thousands of containers. So throwing 30 or 40 VMs, per bare metal node is not a problem if the underlying infrastructure is designed right. My hesitancy is we say Kubernetes abstracts away the infrastructure. As soon as you put VMs on it, you're back to thinking a little bit about the infrastructure, which is opposite.
Yeah,
exactly. So your Kubernetes teams, you may be very successful with Kubernetes today, but your requirements never considered such an infrastructure dependence, because Kubernetes sort of hides that from your devs, from your cloud native, from your containers. And so we're introducing obviously big 40 gig containers and then saying, I need a good overlay network. I need a good, persistent storage layer that has the IOPS performance I need.
Yep. Yeah. You start to bring back a lot of those infrastructure concerns that you sort of abstracted away. You purposefully abstracted away when you move to Kubernetes.
Exactly. So yes, can VMO run in all the places? Yes. There are some it's probably not a great idea just because of those target environments just aren't exposing enough for the infrastructure, or you don't have enough options to tune them. And by the way, it could be that it's just don't use EKS or AKS. If someone said, could we just go ahead and use Amazon, that's our preferred cloud, and run bare metal instances and just stand up a Kubernetes cluster on top of it, not have it be EKS, but have it be a Kubernetes cluster on EC2, bare metal instances? Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, that's not much different than doing like a canonical MAS-based bare metal cloud on premise. That would work. We would just have to validate the storage environment. So it could be that the problem more is the managed Kubernetes needs to be massaged in such a way that you're sort of breaking what is managed Kubernetes, and you just need to run Kubernetes on the cloud, and Spectro Cloud does that as well. We don't have to use the EKS or AKS flavor. We can just put it up on bare metal instance types in the cloud. That's probably a better first choice, I would suggest, than sticking on top of a managed Kubernetes. Let's see. I think that's all we have for questions. So let me just sort of sum it up with, we've got some sort of next steps. So let's just first talk about things you can do with Spectro Cloud. We're obviously not demoing here. We're talking about what's possible and our view as industry guys who've been at this for a while and have the gray hairs to show for it. Right. So we have a demo. You can grab the QR codes here, screenshot this, or the after deck will be available. Our doc site goes pretty deeply into what's possible. And then follow on is obviously, we had a webinar actually from one of our product managers that went in much deeper into how we're doing what we're doing, what is KubeVirt. So if you want a technical deep dive, we did one of those a few weeks ago. So that's the first QR code on the left. And then also, obviously SoftwareONE, that they're in the business of consultancy and helping customers go through transformation journeys. So we sort of suggested the first good landing page to go visit Jared and his team is this QR code as well. Jared, any closing comments you want to add?
No, I think you've summed it up really well. What I would encourage you to do is if you're struggling to either get grips around where you are now and where you want to be, find a partner that can help you with that. Obviously, SoftwareONE, we'd love to have a chat with you about your application journey and where you're trying to go. But any really strong partner in this space can help you at least baseline and figure out what are the steps between A and B of where you've got to get to. But I would also say don't don't be afraid right now to take some time to figure out where you've got to be. To Jeremy's point, you may be under pressure to make some quick decisions around renewals or things like that. Get some advice if you don't have confidence in the direction that you want to go, but also don't be afraid to take the time you need to make sure that you're setting this up for success in the future. Because even if you do have to do some sort of price-based assessment right now and make some decisions, don't cut off roads that could lead to a better outcome for you and where you want to drive.
Yeah, that's great, Jared. And I think back to the three options, you may find that you actually end up using a little bit of all three. Some stays on VMware, and you just reduce the spend and reduce the resilience. Maybe that's all your tier one apps, the Oracles and the SAPs and the MS SQLs that have spent some time, and you keep VDI there, or you move to some other options that maybe have other specific. They're more mature now than when you looked at them a decade ago. So great. Yep. Well, Jared, I appreciate you joining me. I think it was a great chat. Hopefully everyone found it informative and useful. And we're around if people want to have one-on-one conversations and pick our brain a little more specifics. Always happy to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. This was great.
Likewise. Thanks, Jared.
Good luck, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Yeah.